India is rolling out a set of simplified labour codes to modernise outdated laws. Unions describe the changes as sweeping and aggressive. So who stands to benefit? Workers seeking job security and fair wages, or employers looking for flexibility and lower staffing costs? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. India, home to the world's second largest workforce, is implementing its biggest labour changes in decades. The government has compressed dozens of laws into 4 simplified codes. It says the overhaul will attract investment. This will be vital after US President Donald Trump imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods. The reforms include popular measures such as minimum wages, equal pay and expanded social security. But trades unions say the codes will only strengthen employers' control and are accusing the government of deceptive fraud. So will the changes increase India's global competitiveness by streamlining rules, or could they create new risks for workers and productivity? We'll explore those issues with our guests in just a moment. But first, a report from Katia Lopez-Jodeyan.
Hundreds of millions of people across India are working under new labor laws. Years in the making, the 4 new codes condense nearly 1,400 conflicting and overlapping regulations to about 350. Among them, a minimum wage guarantee, free annual health checks for workers aged 40 and above, as well as equal pay for women, allowing them to work night shifts with employers obliged to ensure their safety, a move that highlights pressure on the government to address sexual violence in the workforce. But critics say it's a bad deal. Unions are leading protests, insisting the new codes make it easier for companies to fire employees and harder for workers to legally go on strike.
We must remove the basic political economic system today, which is allowing these capitalist class to plunder us, loot us, destroy environment, destroy the working class.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government says the simpler legal framework will create jobs, bolster the economy, and improve India's competitiveness.
अगर भारत को साल 2047 तक विकसित बनाना है.
The rollout comes at a challenging time for India, which is facing 50% tariffs from the US, a trade tax many see as punishment for New Delhi strengthening its ties with Moscow. India is no stranger to labor protests. Farmers, who account for more than 45% of the workforce, have long called for price guarantees for their produce and help with mounting debt. And for years, the government has tried to balance its labor practices with workers' demands. With one of the world's fastest-growing economies and an expanding workforce, India's government must now wait and see how the changes are received by both employers and employees. Katia Lopez-Jodeyan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Right, let's bring in our guests, all 3 of whom are joining us from New Delhi today. Harshil Sharma is a labour economist who specialises in reforms and welfare. Surbhi Kesar is a senior lecturer in economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And Sudip Dutta is the National Secretary of the Centre of Indian Trade Unions. A warm welcome to you all. Harshil, let's start with you. You wrote in The Wire on Tuesday, I think it was, that India's labour laws have long been a maze, an unwieldy tangle of 29 central statutes, hundreds of state amendments, conflicting definitions and overlapping jurisdictions. I mean, something clearly had to change, didn't it? Reform was inevitable. Why then has it been so controversial?
Actually, most of our labor laws in India, many of them dated back to the independence era for India. Maybe many of them were even pre-independence eras, more than 1947. Many of them were even in date since then. the changes have been staggered in India. There have been multiple definitions of who was taken as labor. So compliance was made even more difficult. Who's an employer, who's an employee was under different labor law, who's a worker, who's a workman, these were under different labor law. So because of this, the compliance in the cases of disputes was also getting really difficult. There were multiple minimum wages definitions. India had more than 1,200 different minimum wages. So the courts were inevitable. Step actually in a very right direction, that we had to reduce these compliances. Since 2002, commission was set up to reduce these multiple definitions and these overlapping rules and regulations to simplify them. But yeah, the way they have happened, it is actually controversial because many of the things that have been taken into account, these laws were actually implemented or passed from the Parliament of India in the year 2019 to 2020. Around that, all these 4 labor laws were passed from the Parliament. But till now, they were not implemented because of high resistance from the workers and about many of the provisions or the sections of the labor laws.
Okay, Harshil, there's a lot to unpack there. Sudip, why are the unions so opposed to these changes?
Let us not confuse about the simplification of the labor codes. Why we are opposing? 90% of the India's organized sector workforce will be outside the ambit of any protective legislation. There is scope. Now there is a scope for the employers to stretch over the working hour up to 12 hours. With paying 8 hours work and making the worker stay in the factory for more 4 hours. The fixed term employment in the permanent and perennial job is now legalized. There is a blow over the right to strike. All factories now all establishments now need to give 14 days notice. Even during the conciliation, they cannot go for strike. So it is nothing about simplification. It is about making the Indian labor unarmed in front of capital. And what is the situation of Indian labor? For last 1 decade, the wage share is reducing. Last year, 47,000 workers, daily wage earners, they committed suicide because they don't know where to go, to whom they can ask for. So given the precarious situation of the Indian labor force, and we are not talking about the 85% of the workers who are working in the unorganized sectors. So the entire labor regime is going to undergo a drastic change where the minimum labor protections will be going outside the scope of the Indian workers. Right. So we are protesting. It's natural. It is making the Indian labor pre-colonial in front of the exploitation.
Okay, we'll come to you to the union protests in just a moment. Surbhi, are the unions right? Do these new codes give employers greater flexibility at the expense of things like job security and bargaining power for workers?
Thanks, Adrian. I think, yes. I mean, it is quite a condensed and complex set of changes that have happened. But I think it needs to be placed in the context that India is an economy where 50% of the workforce is outside any sort of wage labor relations. So if we are trying to understand India's labor problem and trying to resolve it, this comes in a way which is not necessarily positive for the labor. And within that, we are basically talking about enterprises, even in the non-agricultural sector. 98% of India's enterprises actually do not employ, up till 10 workers in terms of the workforce that it represents. 75% of India's workforce is basically in enterprises that are less than 10 total workers, and therefore many of them are in fact not even covered under many of the regulations that exist. And of course, that have actually now been even more relaxed. For example, the occupational safety, the factory coverage threshold has been raised from 10 to to 20 workers, and that has been quite a big change, which is not necessarily in the positive direction. And I think also this has to be seen in the broader context of India's move towards liberalization, which started in 1991, but has been much more entrenched in the last 2 decades with the farmer laws that were ultimately taken back that we saw, etc. So those go in shifting the power in the favor of in capital rather than labor. And that is the broader context in which we need to place it. And even within that, much of labor is, in fact, not even coming under the purview of what is majorly being done.
Harshil, picking up on what Surbhi was saying there, when she said something about 90%, was it, or 85%, Sudip was talking about 90% of the workforce that's outside or unorganized in nature. You said that in your piece in The Wire, the reforms won't apply. 85% was the figure you quoted of the workforce that is unorganized in nature. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I'll give you a broad numbers of it. In India currently we don't have exact total number of workers that are working, but estimates approximately I would give you around 540 million as the total workforce of India. And as rightly pointed out by Surbhi and Sudeep, is like around 460 to 490 approximately million workers are working in informal sector, and 85% are working in unorganized sector. So around 90% are informal, but 85% is unorganized sector. But one thing that needs to be pointed out here is that around COVID time, when there was a mass exodus of workers traveling from one place to another, there was no act or any scheme of the government that could support them, because Indian government did not have the data of the workforce or of actual workers who were working. So I think from that time to now, right now, India, with the digitization going on, right now we have a data of around 310 million out of these 460 to 490 million workers. We have the data of each and every individual worker available. If again something sort of a COVID sort of a situation happens, so Indian government can actually give some sort of a welfare scheme. So I think the Social Security Code actually mentions about these unorganized workers who can avail some welfare benefits or welfare schemes. The point that needs to be taken into account of is how these things get implemented. In India, and around majority of states, on an average, for around 70,000 workers, there is one labor inspector. So even when you have so many compliances, we had so many labor laws. So even after that simplification, how the implementation will happen? How will these labor inspectors use this digitization, use this data of workers and actually help the workers? That is something which is a point of contention right now.
Okay, Sudip, I mean, how much of the union anger about this is to do with the way in which all of this is now being implemented and not so much the codes themselves? Is it the codes or the rather disorganized and haphazard way in which the codes are now being introduced and implemented?
See, Indian trade unions were protesting against the codes for the last 6 years. Like 2019, the wage code came, and 2020, the other three codes came.
All right,
we were protesting.
Let me interrupt you for a moment. The government has said many times that it's ready to listen and to talk to the unions about its demands over these labour codes. And you talked about, this goes back several years, but only if the unions provide, quote, constructive feedback. Now today, I've been reading the joint press release from 10 labour unions, which says, let me quote, "The government is trying to enslave the whole section of the wealth producers to the profit mongers." The unions sent a strong message that the notification of these codes amidst a deepening unemployment crisis and rising inflation is nothing short of a declaration of war on the working masses. The union government, in cahoots with its capitalist cronies, is attempting to take the country back to the exploitative era of master-servant relationship. And it goes on. The platform of central trade unions sends a serious warning to the government that the working people of India will put up a formidable fight until the labour codes are withdrawn. How is that constructive feedback?
No, this has come after unilaterally the labor codes were notified. For the last 6 years, we are demanding, and you must know, India has a very established tripartite system. It is called Indian Labour Conference. From 2015, last 10 years, this ILC has not been taken place. And that ILC could be a very good platform for the Indian workers, the employer classes, and the government to discuss about the labor codes. And we have given in written again and again our problems with the labor codes. You can see that the exclusion of Indian workforce from the ambit of labor legislation cannot be accepted by the Indian trade unions. And when they are giving power to the employer class to stretch over the working hours, to take away the right to association, the Indian workers, we have given in written, we have met the minister, and we have had several rounds of discussions. But if you want to talk, then you have to come up with a decent proposal to put the workers into confidence.
Surbhi, India's economy has grown by 105% in the last decade. It grew by 7.4% year on year in the first quarter of this year. It is the world's fourth largest economy. Why are the unions so unhappy? Where is all of that wealth going? Are all of India's people benefiting from that growth? And if not, why not?
So, I mean, keeping aside the controversies on how growth in India is calculated, even if we take these figures at face value, there has been a massive debate in the country of how polarizing India's economic growth has been. India's economic growth is highly, highly unequal. We are basically seeing the incomes and the profits of those at the top percentiles and deciles actually rising, but that is moving further and further away from the rest of the country. And the reason why we're seeing that happening is that economic growth has been of the kind that it has not, in fact, absorbed labor in the way that one would have ideally wanted it to be, in the way development project envisaged it to be. So now, in absence of that, what is happening to the workers? That's a big question, right? For the longest time post-COVID, India's movement out of agriculture has become much more stunted over time, which is a great cause of concern because there was this expectation of the movement to happen. Moreover, a lot of the jobs that are being created are not the kind of jobs that one finds desirable. Even in the non-agricultural sector, you have a huge proportion of people subsisting in these what are called the self-employed enterprises, which is what forms the majority of what you call this unorganized sector, etc., which are people working with family-based enterprises, with family workers, without any sort of capital wage labor relation existing whatsoever. In a lot of work that we did, we basically find that the possibilities of India's informal sector to in fact grow and transition into big enterprises is actually extremely subdued. That is not something, that's not a trend that we are seeing happening. India's labor market is of the kind that it's extremely fractured and fragmented. In a work I recently did with Rosa Abraham, we find that there's only 7 to 8% of India's workforce that is stably in some sort of permanent salaried work. The rest is the huge churn that happens across different forms of informal wage arrangements. People have extremely precarious livelihoods, and what then that we see is presented in terms of this India's high unequal growth process that we've seen unfolded in the past many decades.
Harshil, to what extent did President Trump's 50% tariffs influence the timing and urgency of this labor overhaul, which has been a long time coming? I know Russia's President Putin is in New Delhi on Thursday for a bilateral summit. India, of course, under pressure from the US to cut back on its purchases of Russian oil. But the two nations at this summit are going to announce that they want to expand bilateral trade by up to, $100 billion a year by 2030. What are we to make of all of that? How does all of that play in to what we're discussing now?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a very direct evidence of that. The Trump's 50% tariff, did it influence the timing of the urgency in India's labor reform? But yeah, right now the global tariffs instability has increased, and there's a need for India to appear manufacturer friendly. Do these laws help in India appear manufacturing friendly? Yeah, they do. They show like many of the compliances in the forms that had to be filled earlier, those are declining. So in that way, it's a strategically, it may be a decision around that. But currently, I don't feel there would be any direct evidence about that, because drafting of these codes started around 2015. They were completed around 2018, passed around 2019-20. There is no direct evidence for that.
Sudip, what specific aspects of these reforms are the trade unions calling a deceptive fraud? And you hinted at it a few moments ago. Are these new labour codes going to trigger more widespread industrial action if workers agree with the unions that these codes are weakening their rights? And do the unions care about whether that harms India's productivity or perhaps even puts off international investors?
See, for last 1 decade, government is saying that lots of reforms have been done to bring investment or to make India's productive sector more investing into the market. 12 lakh crore rupees has been written off from the public sector banks in favor of the big bourgeois industrialists. Okay, and lakhs of crore rupees. If you see the recent employment link incentive, 1 lakh crore rupees was given to the corporate classes for making the employment more employment friendly. But what is happening? The recent industrial index of industrial production, IIP, if you see, it is coming down in India, and it is coming down for last several years. If you see last 5 years, more than 2 lakh enterprises were shut down, and these all reports are coming now. So what is happening in India? Because the producers are also consumers. The workers, we are discussing that not only the industrial producer as well as the producer working in the small factories or household producers, all of these are consumers. India's consumer class, India's population, it is not consuming. It is losing the capacity to consume. It is surviving with minimum amount of wage or income. So the problem doesn't lie with the investment. The problem lies with the consumption. If you want to increase the consumption, you have to pay the workers. Taking away the right of workers, taking away the right of the producers of consumption, and India's real wage is coming down drastically for last 1 decade. Okay. The problem lies with the consumption of the people of India. So the government should motivate the people of India to consume, protect the people of India to consume, tax the super riches, and distribute the fruit of the labor to the people. Then only the India's investment process puzzle can be solved.
All right. Surbhi, women have held large ongoing protests against violence and rape, many of those assaults often occurring while women are commuting to work or at work itself and on school campuses. Now, these new laws permit women to work night shifts, with employers being responsible for their safety. How much of a comfort to women will this be? Will women be forced to work night shifts even if they feel unsafe in doing so?
So in India, the women's employment issue has been quite a complex one, right? We did see at the time when India's incomes were rising, women did withdraw from the workforce. And a lot of India's women workforce comes from rural sector and agricultural sector in the country. Now, with this increase of, making women able to work at night or allowing employers to hire, it's basically just increasing the complete pool of labor that is available. But in India, we have already a problem of surplus workers where the capital and where the policies are not able to absorb those workers. So basically, the question of women's work is that of labor demand coming for work and in good jobs where women can in fact work. In fact, given that there's an absence of support for care work, domestic work, etc., being provided at a community or at a social level or at a policy at a government level, what then ends up happening is that women have to take up jobs that allow them more flexible hours, allowing them to take care of work at home. But what that ends up doing is imposing a double burden on women rather than really allowing them to participate in the workforce out of as a voluntary or as an empowering mechanism. In fact, it just becomes one more tool to suppress wages even more. And we do know about the consistent ways in which, even if you do not allow direct discrimination of women's wages, women are occupationally segregated into those jobs that tend to be much more lower paid. So even capturing discrimination there is not that straightforward, and therefore implementing the compliance mechanism that the policies are talking about. And finally, this question about women, the protection being provided by the employers, that in fact requires a complete overhauling in terms of public delivery system, in terms of public transport systems, in form of various things. In fact, what ends up happening in most of these cases is to put on cameras and have surveillance, which basically just puts women under the gaze rather than really trying to deal with the more basic problems of lack of women's safety in most of the workspaces.
Okay, Harshil, picking up on what Sudip was saying a few minutes ago.
Yeah, Adrian, can I just come in?
Yeah, please, very quickly.
Yeah, so on the women issue, Adrian, it's like I recently did a study for around 400 construction workers in Delhi, women construction workers, asking them why are they not being employed. So there was a site for over 5,000 workers, not even a single woman employee. Asking, and I had a word with employers, why is that the case? And the responses I receive is there are too many labor laws, compliances that I have to take care of. There is a maternity benefit that I have to make creches, I have to make living conditions in certain way, and which I don't have to comply with. So the laws that were made to protect the women workers, they were that resulted in deterrent for their employment. So even changing those laws, making better laws, compliance is something that we are struggling with. Even putting great laws in place, we need a lot more inspectors to actually go on ground and implement actual sections and the rules that are being taught in these labor codes.
All right, Sudip, I've got about 2 minutes left here. Feel free to pick up on what we've been discussing in the last few minutes, but I just wanted to ask, to what extent are Indian workers now merely being subjected to the same treatment that workers in the US and Europe have long been subjected to for many, many years? Isn't what the government is trying to do simply a part of modern day life?
You see that this is happening for the last couple of decades all over the world. But what do you want to say? That the least form of protection that Indian workers were having till now, it is going to be snatched away. And I will put a very small statistics that if you see that the top 1%, top 10 companies of India out of 500, the profit rate is very high. The next 40, the profit rate is lower. And next 450, the profit rate is coming down. So the profit rate is coming down across the line of the capital size. And government of India wants to shift the burden to the employees, the workers of the lower category of the employment. That is the bottom 50% of the employees. So this is going to shift India's entire workforce into a slavery-like situation.
Okay. Many thanks indeed. We're going to have to end it there. Thanks for being part of the programme today, Harshil Sharma, Surbhi Kesar and Sudip Datta. And thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on this issue, you can join us on our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can always join the conversation on X. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here, we'll see you again. Bye for now.